Stephen Dorrell, you were a Conservative MP from 1979 to 2015. You were a big figure in the party, you held various cabinet jobs. Why on earth are you now a member of the Liberal Democrats?
Well, I have a simple way of summarising that, which is that I didn't leave my party left me. So I was actually a member of the Conservative Party for 49 years. I joined it when Ted Heath was leading Britain into Europe. I left it when Theresa May was leading Britain out of Europe, and the two things are connected. I was, at the time that I left the Tory party, I was chair of the European movement, because I passionately believe that Brexit is a fundamental mistake, what John Major actually describes as an historic mistake, which, as I often say, is as close as John ever gets to using bad language in public.
But the people voted for it. It's a democracy, right?
Yeah, they didn't vote for the Brexit we've got. They voted, it's absolutely true they voted for Brexit. There were a wide range of Brexits on offer, and we've chosen the most damaging. Or rather, I should be much more precise. The faction that currently controls the Tory party chose the most damaging option of Brexit.
Is there any way back for you to come back to the Conservative Party? Is that remotely possible?
No, is the short answer, because I do believe that the Tory party is responsible for an extremely damaging version of Brexit. That's the first reason. There's actually a second reason. And on this, I freely acknowledge I've changed my view. I've always been an advocate of the two-party system, on the basis that you have two permanent coalitions and invite the voters to choose between them. I'm now opposed to the two-party system because what's actually happened around Brexit's the most egregious example, but actually my own area of particular personal interest in the health service is another victim of the two-party system, in my view. What it does is to reduce political discussion to a binary choice between two structures. And those structures are victims, both of them in the last 10 years, of factional politics, where the voters simply aren't involved. The Labour Party, that was true of the Corbyn years. The Tory party has been true of the Brexit argument. And what I therefore believe we now ought to have in this country is a more plural, a more nuanced political system. And for that, you need electoral reform, which is why I'm now a Liberal Democrat.
But we don't have electoral reform yet. We won't have it for the next general election. You're going to wake up with Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. Who would you rather see? My
dream outcome is Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, because I think he'd be better placed to do some short-term things than the current Tory party, but with a very important qualification. The ideal outcome is Keir Starmer leading a minority Labour government that then has to deal with the point that our political system is broken.
Do you know, it's remarkable what you've said, because I grew up, when I was getting into politics, you were this big figure that I remember from the Tory party, and it's quite extraordinary to hear you say that when push came to shove, you would prefer to wake up with a Labour Prime Minister.
Because I think Keir Starmer is in better control, and this is a relative measurement, in better control of the dangerous factions in the Labour Party than Rishi Sunak is in control of the dangerous factions of the Tory party.
Really interesting. One of the cabinet jobs that you had, this was under John Major, you were Health Secretary. The NHS is never far from the top of our political debate, discussion, priorities. Imagine you're back behind your desk, you're Health Secretary today. What's the number one thing that you're going to tackle?
That actually is easy today, which is to remember that the health service can't deliver anything unless it got full engagement from all the staff of the health service and a realistic workforce plan for the health service and also for the social care system. And so I think the highest priority for Steve Barclay, and it, as has been the case since he was appointed, now getting on for 6 months ago, is to sort out the pay issues and to re-engage with the workforce of the NHS and to set out his plan for how the workforce of the NHS is going to be developed over the coming period beyond the end of this Parliament.
Did you have a constructive relationship with the health unions when you were Health Secretary?
Like any health secretary, I had a occasionally testy relationship with the trade unions. But what I would like to think is that whether it's the BMA and the representatives of the medical profession, or the RCN and the other nursing unions, and importantly, the other people who work in the health service, is that, first of all, importantly, my door was always open. I was always happy to talk to them. Secondly, I am a believer in the review body system that takes the immediate issues of pay out of day-to-day politics, because I think that creates more space for the dialogue that ought to take place between the person who's politically responsible for the NHS and the social care system. I insist on linking the two together. The person who's politically responsible for them, and the representatives of the people who deliver them. It isn't the health secretary that delivers the healthcare system, blindingly, obviously. But if you're going to deliver your political objectives, you have to have an open line of dialogue with the people who represent the staff of the system.
Let's use the benefit of your experience and those decades of perspective. You were in Parliament for many prime ministers, from Thatcher to May.
I was never actually. I left in 2015. So David Cameron
was your
last prime minister.
Your last prime minister. If you had to single out one or two, I'll let you have three if you insist, as the most impressive figures in those 40 years, who are you going to plump for?
So, well, I think history will be very clear that there are two in that list that left their imprint on the country. And one of whom is obviously Margaret Thatcher. I voted for the Thatcher government, supported the Thatcher government throughout its tenure. I never described myself as a Thatcherite at the time, and I'm certainly not going to describe myself in that language now. But you can't take away from the fact, and this is where today's sort of Thatcherite monkey, I think they misunderstand the nature of Margaret Thatcher. She was a very, very skilled politician. She knew how to build a coalition, including, in my case, people who didn't fundamentally agree with her instincts, but were prepared to empower her to do things that needed to be done. So she's an impressive figure. And the other figure that history will clearly remember is Tony Blair, who made a huge mistake in Iraq. I say that as somebody who voted for Iraq, so I'm not seeking to rewrite history. It was a huge historical error. But nonetheless, Tony, and I've worked with him clearly in the European argument more recently, reasonably closely. I like Tony Blair, and I respect the fact that there's a phrase he uses a lot, which I think is 100% right and is missed by most politicians most of the time, which is that democracy is government by explanation. And that's, ministers have to be prepared to explain what they're doing if they're going to invite people to support them. And
one other issue where I want to get the benefit of your perspective, it's sort of accepted at the moment that politics is incredibly toxic, that there has never been so much abuse directed towards politicians. There must have been toxicity and abuse in your time, though.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's toxicity levels rise and fall. I mean, the only time I remember walking through Loughborough Market and being personally abused was at the time of the community charge, the poll tax. So there was a high level of toxicity then, deservedly in my view, but that's now all history. So toxicity, I think, rises and falls. What I think is genuinely different today is the willingness of politicians to talk to their echo chamber. I've seen it said multiple times by politicians actually on both sides of the political divide, which is why I don't like the two-party system. People think, the people say. What they actually mean is my Twitter sphere, my Twitter followers say, because they don't actually talk to the people on the other side of the argument. I think, and this is actually one thing that I attribute, both in fairness, Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair understood you only win in politics if you explain to people who don't agree with you why you should do what you want to do. Today's politicians talk to their supporters. They forget the people whose support they need if they're going to create a majority.
Very well put, if I may say so. Let's come to the current day. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen the release of lots of WhatsApp messages, the lockdown files, the revelations about decisions that were taken during the pandemic, which we were not aware of how they were formulated. What lessons can we learn from what we now know as a result of those leaked messages?
Well, I suppose there are three things we can learn. The first is the simplest one, which is that all politicians should remember that when they write words in electronic media, they are part of the public record that will live forever. So first point, that's a pretty simple mechanistic point. The second point is, in a sense, the least important, which is that given that we have access to those private messages, I think we should screen out some of the sillier things, the most obviously silly things that are said in those messages. Because I actually think there's a third point that's really seriously important, which is that government is a public process, and the decisions that are made by government, when people talk about process, it sounds as though they're kind of boring accountants and, you know, have we ticked the box and have we covered all the bases? Tony Blair, I've already talked about the mistakes of the Iraq War. When the inquiry reported on the Iraq War, it said that one of the key failings was what it called sofa government. Well, what we've got in these WhatsApp messages is exactly the same phenomenon in the middle of the pandemic. There is process in government for a reason. It is a public process. And I think these WhatsApp messages and the mistakes that they led to reinforce again the dangers of sofa government.
Stephen Dorrell, an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.